All right, thank you.
Okay, welcome to the May 18th, 2010 meeting of the Glendale Redevelopment Agency. Can we have a roll call, please?
Agency members Draymond.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Quintero. Weaver.
Here.
Chair Friedman.
Here. May we have your report?
The agenda for the May 18, 2010 regular meeting of the Glendale Redevelopment Agency was posted on Thursday, May 13, 2010 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
Thank you. And what is next?
Motion to approve the minutes.
So moved. Second.
Okay. Can we have a roll call?
Agency members Draymond.
Yes.
Najarian.
Yes.
Quintero. Weaver.
Aye.
Chair Friedman.
Yes. What's next, please?
Next is oral communications. Discussion is limited to items not part of this agenda. Each speaker is allowed 5 minutes. Members of the redevelopment agency may question or respond to a speaker, but there will be no debate or decision, and the matter may be referred to staff through the executive director for investigation and report. There was one card submitted.
I have 2 cards. Herbert Milano first.
Redevelopment Chair Friedman, members of the Redevelopment Agency, city staff, my name is Herbert Milano. For the past several months, I have been attempting to obtain the results of the financial activity of the Americana at Brand. I have been challenged in the past with regard to my right to obtain that information, even though in the past I have requested it via the California Public Records Act, and I have received the financial performance of the Americana. I received it for the 2008. Yet when I come again to try to request it for the full calendar year, I'm encountering roadblocks in trying to obtain the information. In times past, when I came before you, I've been challenged to whether or not I should have the prerogative or even the justification for asking for it. So I decided to do some research, and I have here with me summary of the proposed town center project economics prepared by Internal Audit, March 29, 2004. In this document, the city makes a case for the investment of the $77 million, the subsidy we get Caruso Affiliated Holdings at the time. And within this document, we have summary of property tax increment revenue. We have projections with regard to sales tax. We have actually a validation for this particular investment. And as part of this profit sharing agreement, the city prepared this document and hired and paid tens of thousands of dollars to outside consultants to help justify to the public this particular investment of $77 million. And so all I'm asking is that since it is this authority's prerogative to get that information from Caruso Affiliated Holdings, that this is a public record that should be available for anyone who wants to check on what promises were given back in 2004 and to the actuals of what we're actually getting now. Because I found many discrepancies in my study of the Americana at Brand. Among the discrepancies, it's stated in this document, for example, that the city acquisition cost for the land was $77 million. I obtained records that show that the total acquisition was $84 million. This is what the city paid for those parcels, and that is at the original cost. The city never decided to reevaluate this thing and say, here is the current market cost of all of those parcels, and this is what we're basically gifting Caruso Affiliated Holdings. The city never did any study with regard to saying if we take contiguous parcels of land, the overall value of that land increments significantly, and therefore the value of the amount that is being given Caruso will be much higher. The city never did take into consideration that you changed the zoning such that he could go up to 65 feet, basically increasing the value of the airspace, therefore increasing the value of the amount that is being gifted to Caruso. That never came into being. Nonetheless, I figured if we just take the cost of the actual investment, the millions of dollars that we're paying every year with regard to the interest on the bonds that the city had to borrow, and we just simply take what was the property tax revenue, what was the sales tax revenue, and take that and say, well, are we balancing out? Because if we cannot do an evaluation on the hard numbers, which are those, how in the world are we going to evaluate the more soft evaluation with regard to we were able to influence another entity to come and build in Glendale? That's very subjective. Unless someone came back to you and says, we're absolutely dying to do this because the American is there and here's the document. But at the end of the day, it's only a subjective number. If you cannot report on the hard numbers, how can we trust any other subjective evaluation that the Americana was able to bring other property tax revenues? So I'm here to appeal to you to request that the city attorney's office and the redevelopment agency produce these records that I requested through the California Public Records Act. Thank you very much.
Mike Mohill?
Good afternoon, Chairman Friedman and council members. Today I want to speak about the arts and entertainment section on Maryland Avenue. Over the weekend, I got a copy of the Pasadena Weekly newspaper. Weekly, I don't know if members on the staff have seen it. I have a copy for everybody. Talks about two important areas. Talks about it's titled Pasadena Rocks and how they're going to handle their redevelopment area and what is new and exciting in Pasadena. The other article is about the arts, the traditional arts, like the Pasadena Playhouse, okay, that's demised. The other opera that's demised. Other traditional stuff that is demised. And another article I have here is about the actual bankruptcy, an article about that too. I have copies of all this for you to read later on, because I think it'll help us in our direction. This is the theater. This is theaters, new stage bankruptcy. Pasadena Playhouse, 1,000 to 5,000 creditors filed for Chapter 11. Also, 22 years, Opera Pacific in Orange County and Costa Mesa also was demised this year. Okay? I have a team of writers, Mr. Draymond, including Mr. Milano, Mr. Allen, yourself, Mr. Najeri, Mr. Friedman, Mr. Weaver, the whole city. They all helped me write my speeches. Today it's all in pen, so I didn't have time to go up in front of the computer. So this is a rough draft.
Is it a cold reading?
It's a cold reading, as they would say in theater, sir. Okay. Public taste is always changing. You cannot make young adults patronize the arts when most had no exposure growing up. A politician took music and art out of the schools some 15 plus years ago, leaving a void for the arts. Instead, sports remained in the schools and they brought money to the school coffers. Friday and Saturday is football. At every high school, and Monday night football. We have the NBA, we have the World Series, and we have the World Cup, and goes on for soccer. Why are sporting events sold out weeks, months, and years ahead, and the theater is dying for attendance, for people to come? 2 for 1. Come in early, we'll give you early tickets discounts, right, Mr. Draymond? Theater. At the Brand Library, okay, why doesn't the director of art and music come before this council, like Mr. Leon Mayer from our main library, and make public announcements? I asked Mr. Blair from the Brand Library and his boss, why don't they come here and make those announcements on Tuesday nights? You know what the answer I get from those those people? Nothing. They don't show up. But the gentleman from the from Central Library shows up every week. We know his name, rank, and serial number, but not the people from the Music and Art Department from the Brand Library. Why? Don't they care? Are we not paying them enough money? Please, okay? Why does the City Hall Council meetings are on the same night of the Glendale Youth Glendale Youth Orchestra? Same night. If we're interested in the arts, why don't we change it? Why, even when I told board members of the Glendale Youth Orchestra to come before this council and make an announcement, make their presentation, guess what they did? Nothing. Why don't they participate in this process? Aren't they interested in having the public come to their event? It's cultural. Why in the city of Pasadena does the beautiful Ambassador Theater, with all its great acoustics, remain almost empty every night for the past 28 years? Even the converted Roxy Theater, movie theater in Glendale, which is now more or less a small theater nightclub, remains empty almost every night. Why in NoHo, North Hollywood, with all its theater and clubs, they're struggling today too? When was the last time council members went to the Ford Theater or the Greek Theater? And what all did you all see? Maryland Avenue was conceived as a high-end retail, restaurants, and movie theater. Today, the area is dying, and tastes have changed. Changing taste has demised the manned theaters in Glendale. Why even Circuit City did not bring in enough foot traffic for Maryland Avenue? Tastes keep changing, and I hope before we make this big investment in Maryland, we think about it. The Broadway
You can
lofts.
wrap up, please. Your time's done.
Okay, the Broadway lofts, okay, it's a good idea if we're going to keep it with the bowling alley, but we need something that's compatible with it.
Okay, thank you. What's next, please?
I have these copies for.
Okay, you can hand it to the
On
city clerk.
On the
Okay.
business agenda, at 6A is public hearing, Director of Community Redevelopment and Housing regarding 27-space parking exception requested by Lebanese Arak Corporation for property located at 722 and 724 Thompson Avenue. At A1 is a motion approving parking exception based on findings and conditions.
Okay, Mr. Lanzafame.
Ms. Chair, members of the Redevelopment Agency, this is a request for parking exception on a building that has been rehabilitated and a change of use. You have on your desk there in front of you a letter in support of the parking exception and a letter expressing concerns with that. To give you a staff report, I'd like to call to the podium Project Manager Alan Castillo.
Good afternoon, Agency Chair. Good afternoon, Agency Chair Friedman and members of the agency. Lebanese Arak Corporation.
You could just state your name for the record.
I'm sorry, Alan Castillo with the Redevelopment Agency.
Thank you.
Lebanese Arak Corporation started as a family business over 60 years ago and has grown into a successful international beverage company. LAC imports, distributes bottles, juices, and waters on a wholesale basis. LAC also imports and distributes beer, wine, brandy, and spirits. LAC currently operates their business in a 13,500 square foot building at 710 Roberta Avenue with 7 employees. The new facility at 722 and 724 Thompson Avenue will allow LAC to increase the number of employees to 10 and expand into a 29,000 square foot space. Of the 29,000 square foot space, LAC is proposing to convert approximately 2,500 square feet, which is about 9% of the warehouse, to bottle various non-alcoholic beverages. The zoning considers the bottling operation a manufacturing use. Per code, when multiple uses are considered, the use with the most restrictive parking requirement is applied to the entire tenant space. In this case, the entire 29,200 square feet is calculated with a parking requirement for a manufacturing use, even though the use would only occupy about 9% of space. The new use has a required space parking demand of 74 spaces. The required parking for the change of use cannot be met on site. Therefore, the applicant is requesting a 27 parking exception to meet current code. Staff believes that the effective increase in parking demand will be much less than the 27 spaces, as the majority of the subject spaces will be used strictly for warehousing. Once the project is completed, LAC will provide 27 parking spaces on the site. The employees of the front of the building will utilize 10 of the 27 spaces, leaving 17 spaces for the warehouse in the rear. We have the property owner, and if you have any questions.
Are there any questions? I just want to ask, does staff believe that that's a sufficient amount of parking for this use?
Yes, for the use that they have right now, it is sufficient. They only have 10, and the rear portion, which would allow, if they lease it out to warehouse, is 18,000 square feet, which is 1-to-1. They're actually one less short is 17 spaces. If they were to go to a more restrictive use, creative corridor type, they would have to come back for a parking exception for that use.
Okay, thank you. I have 2 cards if there's no further staff comments. Are there any questions? Ms. Van Meiden?
Yes, I just recommend you open the public hearing prior to taking those cards. Thank you.
Thank you. I will open the public hearing. I have 2 cards. First, Herbert Milano. I have 6A. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Rubik Ovanesian?
Good afternoon. My name is Rubik Ovanesian. I'm a property and business owner in the city of Glendale, PO Box 271, Glendale, California. I'm here to speak in support of the parking exception for several reasons. I've known the family members for over 15 years. I've visited their site where they do currently business, and Roberta, they use a very limited number of parking spaces based on their use. And I think staff have done a fantastic job in studying the current use and applying it for the new expansion. I also applaud the owners of the business for, in current economy, where on a weekly basis the business is closing in the city, they're confident and they're taking the step forward in expanding their business at the current location. So with that, I would ask to support the members of the council and redevelopment agency to support it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to close the public hearing, and we do have the property owners in the audience if any of the agency members have any questions for them specifically. Otherwise, I'll take comments. Mr. Najarian.
I'll take a stab at a motion if anyone
Go right ahead.
is.
It's a no-brainer.
Well, it's appropriate that I make the motion. It's. I'd like to move the item at 6A1, please.
I'll second it.
Okay. I have a motion and a second. Can I have a roll call, please?
Agency members Raymond,
Yes.
Najarian,
Yes.
Quintero, Weaver,
Aye.
Chair Friedman.
Yes. Thank you. Congratulations. What's next, please?
At 6B is presentation, Director of Community Redevelopment and Housing regarding Glendale Redevelopment Agency and Economic Development Program proposed budget for fiscal year 2010-2011.
Mr. Lansapane.
Ms. Chair, if you will indulge me, very similar format and report on the redevelopment agency and economic development, called the other part of the house. We will go over the same topics fund by fund. Our mission statement, surprisingly the same. We're using development to improve quality of life. In redevelopment, our core services are centered in the Central Redevelopment Project area, which is basically our downtown, and then the San Fernando Road corridor. In economic development, much of that program is funded by the Glendale Redevelopment Agency and is tied to those two project areas. We also have a small fund, a small general fund that we use for more flexibility. I wanted to start by reviewing for you some of the set-aside for parks and libraries. In October of 2007, the Redevelopment Agency adopted a policy whereby you would set aside 75% of the tax increment on new housing units and 25% of the tax increment generated by commercial development. Unfortunately, for the last 2 years, we have not had any development beyond those baseline projects that were planned for other uses, or their funds for other uses. However, we do have a project that is under construction now. We refer to it as the S&K project. S&K is no longer involved in it at all, but it is a project, condominium project at Broadway and Louise. Approximately 36 units, 32 units, condominium units. When those come online, we will be setting aside the tax increment for parks and libraries, parks and library development. We think that in that first year that they hit the rolls, probably be a portion, maybe $35,000, but it will grow to close to $100,000 within a few years, and we would be setting that aside for as long as the redevelopment agency is in existence for these types of uses. In our annual accounting, what I've listed here are some of the things that we put together on an annual report for you at the budget time. In our Central Glendale project area, Fund 240, this is generally how it, the summary, how it breaks out. Going through each of those, we have a big reduction in salaries and benefits because the redevelopment agency funds many internal service providers like city attorneys and folks in the finance department. So those salaries have now been backed out, and they will be reallocated through an cost allocation formula, and will show up in our M&O. You see under M&O, and we'll spend a little time here, there's a decrease of $8.2 million. That's because we funded the state's take of our $11 million out of local Glendale funds in M&O here, and that's why it was so high at $14.8 million. Well, it looks like good news, great. It's $8.2 million less. Included in that $6.5 million for 2010-11 is approximately $2.2 million, which is the second take from the state, from the city of Glendale and its redevelopment efforts. So while we're seeing a decrease, there still is pain with money being spent to Sacramento.
So Phil, quickly, if I can, adjusted for those, the M&O stay is roughly the same. It sounds like you take 2 out of the $6.5 million in 10-11 and 11 out of the 9-10. Adjusting for the $11 million payment to the state and $2 million in the upcoming year, the M&O stay is roughly in the $4.5 million range, $3 to $4 million range.
Pretty much.
Okay.
The city loan last year, I believe it was.
I'm sorry, Phil. And then one more time, I can't resist one more emphasis. $13 million that could have gone into local projects, whether economic development, infrastructure improvement, open space, public facilities, gone to help close the ever-widening gap in the state's budget. And we as yet have no guarantee, although the governors may revise only TAP's redevelopment agencies for another $350 million statewide. I'm not sure that May revise had tapped redevelopment for the $2 billion this year. It was originally $350 million this year, went to $2 billion as they got into the final throes of the budget. So we've yet to see the final budget for the upcoming year. So that $350 million statewide, $2 million to us locally, could be larger by the time the budget's put to bed.
Mr. Thurber, what if we don't have any money left to give in another year? Then what do they do to us? Is it the death sentence?
The state legislation provides that the city's general fund may make the payment, not obligatory. It may make the payment. In the absence of an agency being able to make its payment, and it can borrow from its housing set-aside funds for a period of time to do that if it must. But in the absence of making a payment, then what is known in the industry as the death penalty is meted out to the respective agency. And I think in LA County, 2 agencies have not been able to make this year's payments. And the death penalty provides that essentially you go out of business. You can continue to meet your current contractual obligations, but you can't take on any new projects or commence any new projects, take on any additional debt, and there's limitations on how much you can spend to administer your programs.
Do we have the choice of taking those funds out of our affordable housing component as opposed to economic development, or are we limited?
As I recall, Julie, maybe you're more up in this now. As I recall, you can borrow from your housing set-aside funds if you can't meet the payment out of your agency's general fund money. So I don't think you necessarily have an option. You can turn to your housing set-aside if you can't meet your payment through other means.
I know we're going to see it, but the San Fernando redevelopment, did we give any out of that, or was that coming up, I presume?
We do the lion's share, actually all of it out of Central, where we have the funding available. What I was going to say is we will start looking at projects that would commit funds and actually do that. If we get hit with a death penalty, at least that money would be staying in the city of Glendale. We could probably support or make the payment one more year if it was something like $2 billion. And your staff is going to bring to you alternatives so that you can commit that money rather than just send it to Sacramento and not have any local benefit. So we will be doing that throughout the year.
You said $2 million, not $2 billion, right?
$2 billion of a state take is about $13 million from Glendale. We could afford to do that one more time.
$2 million. Are you saying another?
$13 million per year.
Oh. Then we're dead.
Phil is saying if the state in the upcoming year takes $2 billion statewide instead of $350 million, our payment will go from an anticipated $2 million back up to $11 million again.
Then we're broke.
Then we're broke. Now, frankly, we all took a rather responsible approach this year, and as soon as we found out about the state's take, we set the money aside. We didn't earmark it for projects. In hindsight, we should have identified the projects we would have built with that, so at least as they took it, there would be some connection back to what isn't being done in the community. So in the upcoming year, frankly, we anticipate coming to you and talking about the allocation of funds from redevelopment agency for a whole host of projects, that if the state increases its take, we can at least identify what will not be done in the community. This year made it almost too easy.
The next line is the city loan. This is a repayment of a longstanding loan that the redevelopment agencies had with the city of Glendale. In prior years, our debt service was $2 million. Last year, we raised the rate to what was in market at that time. It was close to 7%, which was comparable to what we were paying for bond funds. That increased our debt service, the redevelopment agency's debt service, to the city by $1 million. Our debt service on the next line, that is for bonded indebtedness, and basically it's flat. Our capital projects decreased by about $3.6 million. That is largely because of funding for the alley project, the pass-through and alley project that was included in 09-10. We have 5 capital projects that we're requesting new money on, as well as about $12 million that is accounted for in other CIP projects and agency projects that we're carrying over from prior years. This is our revenue in the central project area. Again, you see a bit of a dip in the tax increment. That was reflected in the tax or the housing set aside that you saw in the last presentation. There you see our bond proceeds coming in 09-10. The revenue generating, a little bit of a bump on that. That is an increase on the repayment of the loan to the school district to construct Moise Field, as well as the full year of payment from the Embassy Suites. In prior years, there were only portions of the year. Rental income stays the same. Our interest earnings have fallen, and again, result not of our treasurer's wisdom, but just the economy. San Fernando Road Corridor is Fund 241. Again, you see a bit of a dip in salaries and benefits. The majority of that is spreading the director's salary when we did the realignment, spreading the director's salary among some of the housing funds, where we saw a decrease in both. M&O is due to a decrease in pass-through. We pass funds through to other taxing agencies. As we generate less increment, less gets passed through, and that's represented by that $128,000. And then capital projects, there's a jump of little over $300,000. Again, the majority of that is in our facade program. Last year, we did not need to fund that, although we are seeing some interest in the San Fernando Road Corridor, and so we're asking for money to do those projects. In this project area, we have approximately $8.7 million that will be carrying over. Most of that is from railroad crossings that have been committed in prior years. Here's our revenue. Again, you see a bit of a dip in the tax increment. On the county tax sharing, there's a bit of an increase in. You wonder why, if there's less increment, why is there more tax sharing? Just the estimate from last year, we were a bit off. We generated more than we thought. So we've used the number of 2.3. This is money that the county passes back to the city of Glendale. When we formed our project area, we entered into agreements. We take our increment and we send about half of it to the county. As part of the GC3 agreement, they agreed to take 60% of that amount and pass it back to us for regional improvements. Those are listed in our agreement, and that's why there's an asterisk there. They are limited to certain projects.
We should note 60%, not 60% of the pass-through to the county from the project area, 60% of the tax increment generated by Disney's project that would have been passed through to the county gets sent back for projects.
Actually, we take the whole thing.
Do we? Okay.
The whole thing. Interest earnings, again, a bit of a dip due to economy. Our challenges, probably you could end with this first one, state takes of local redevelopment funds. And I know Mr. Starbird is going to say again, I can't resist, but $13 million that could have funded projects in the city of Glendale has now gone to Sacramento to bridge their gaps and make up for their shortfalls. Something else that we've been talking about for the last few years, the project area will sunset in, we believe, 2015. If the legislation that took our money stands, that would go to 2016. They would give you another year, and so you would have another year of collecting tax increment. Nonetheless, there is some things that we should be planning for. How do we maximize that tax increment? And we are doing that through the projects that we bring forward to you and our cash flow. Probably our biggest hurdle, our immediate hurdle, is credit markets. There just is not money being lent or at levels that make sense for developers. There's a lot of interest to do things. However, there just isn't the money yet to bring those forward. Public improvements and facilities on the positive side, we will be funding through our bond Central Library rehabilitation, the soccer field at Columbus, as well as the pass-through that we referred to earlier. We're also funding the improvements to Central Avenue, the reconstruction of that street. And then finally, we will be investigating the potential for new project areas. We'll be coming back with a report to you in a couple weeks on a quick look we had up in the Foothill Corridor as in conjunction with the planning effort that our planning department has done. But we will also be looking at other areas south of the freeway that might be appropriate for redevelopment, new redevelopment project areas.
Are there any questions? I do have one card, so let me open the public hearing. Herbert Milano.
Redevelopment Chair Friedman, members of the Redevelopment Agency, and staff, my name is Herbert Milano. For the past several years, as I've looked at the Redevelopment Agency activity, I find it probably the most challenging of all the financial reports the city gets. Primarily because all of this particular movement that comes in between the general fund and the borrowing that the city makes, and then the monies that eventually the redevelopment gets, and then eventually how those funds are distributed. I think that the type of financial reports that are prepared by the city in general are an accountant's delight. They are really excellent for those individuals working at banks, looking at evaluating a city's creditworthiness, figuring out how much they can actually borrow. But for the general public, these financial reports don't give us a really clear understanding of what is taking place. I, for example, am concerned with regard to the infrastructure improvements, capital improvements, and the set-asides for parks and libraries. When it was presented to the redevelopment agency as a way of basically funding parks and libraries, the first thing that we found was a whole list of grandfathering of all kinds of projects for which they would not have to pay any additional increment funds. And then some of them were given extensions and so forth. But when I look separately at the funding for, let's say, libraries for the past 11 years, if you basically were to graph it out, you will see that the funding for libraries has remained fairly flat in all of these years. I don't even think we have even maintained it at the CPI. You look at that chart and it's incredibly flat. In other words, we're not making the investments. We make capital improvements, but overall, operationally, we're not really addressing those issues. In fact, we're going the opposite. We're reducing the availability of libraries to the public. So you look at the investment in parks, and they've grown higher than the libraries. You can see operationally they have grown. And, I think the public in general is appreciative of the parks that we did get. But what we lose out oftentimes is at this relationship between how redevelopment can allocate clearly for capital improvements and other amenities that the city and this population needs. because it's the issue that I've been bringing back to you, time and time again. How are we addressing the overall needs of these areas that have the highest concentration of people? And how does redevelopment address that? So I'm recommending that redevelopment agency and finance create a product, a report, that allows the public in general to see these trends a lot more clearly, and so that we can hold council accountable and the redevelopment agency with regard to the direction in which we feel maybe it should go. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to close the public hearing. Are there any comments or questions from the agency?
Good question. So realistically, what are our chances of getting a new project area?
With the changes in the redevelopment law over the last several years, it's very, very difficult. Because they've tightened the definition of blight. And it's very, very tight now. And some of the things, for instance, back in 1972, when we adopted our project area, it could be a lack of public infrastructure would be enough to show blight and allow you to form a project area. That's no longer an element that you can use. It's certainly helpful, and you can use redevelopment funds for that. Same thing with small parcels in individual ownership. That was seen as a blighting condition. It no longer is. You now have to show not just physical blight or economic blight, but you have to show both. So it's become very difficult certainly in Glendale. There's plenty of places in California that can do that. But in Glendale, because of the way we've taken care of our city, some of those findings are more difficult to make.
What is the vacancy rate on Foothill, do we think?
I don't know. I can ask if the planning department, just from my driving by, it's not great. In other words, the buildings are full.
The buildings are, it's a low vacancy rate?
Low vacancy rate. I'm sorry. Yes, low vacancy rate.
Is it possible that our state government is tightening up the rules on redevelopment to eventually end redevelopment in this state over time, so the tax dollars that we're keeping here can go directly to Sacramento? They don't have to worry about all this Mickey Mouse going through the cities.
Agency Member Weaver, I wouldn't guess to climb in their head and say that. This is the thing that is baffling to many professionals in my place is that redevelopment in the state of California generates about $2 billion of economic activity. It employs about 300,000 people. Were that a corporation, what would you do to attract that to your state or to your city? And yet we're continuing to see erosion in this tool that we have to improve communities.
And Sacramento doesn't care.
Mr. Starbird, could you remind us about the League of California Cities ballot measure and how that, if it passed or failed, might impact this and the city?
The League's initiative, I'll call it the Taxpayer Protection Act, and there is transportation redevelopment and a whole host of things, was an effort undertaken this year by the League of California Cities with support from a number of transportation advocacy groups, the California Redevelopment Association and others, to make it more difficult for the state to tap local resources in times like they're facing currently. Proposition 1A of 3 years ago attempted to do that, and that essentially closed, at least narrowed the loophole by which the state could take city and county general fund dollars in the way they did back in the early 90s and have done now, I think, twice in this decade in order to close their budget gap by shifting everything from sales tax revenues to property tax revenues. That did a fairly effective job of limiting the state's ability to take local property tax revenues. They can still borrow it in times of fiscal crisis, but they have to repay it with interest, and they can't borrow it again unless they've repaid it. The problem is that still left a number of areas where the state can come and take local resources to solve their budget problems. And last year and this year have been good examples of how they've done that, not just to cities, but to counties, to school districts, and a host of agencies. So the League launched another effort to essentially close many of the loopholes and avenues the state has been able to pursue. And I understand that they have gathered what they believe is adequate signatures, well over 1 million. The initiative and the signatures are currently with the Secretary of State to be verified, and they are anticipating the measure to be on the November ballot of this year. And that would attempt to close the loopholes so the state would have a much, much more difficult time taking and deferring transportation dollars, taking redevelopment dollars, and the things they've been doing for the past several years to close their budget gap.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Dreaman.
Mr. Lansfang, coming back to a previous question about the vacancy rate or the occupancy rate, depending on whether you want to look at the glass as half full or half empty. I continually receive emails from property owners in the Foothill corridor in the Glendale portion, the annex, and the complaints and the concerns continue to be about what the city can do to help with the many vacancies that they as property owners have, their tenants, in other words, or their lack of tenants. I would like to know if we have done an inventory of the businesses on the Foothill corridor between Pennsylvania and Lowell, and because that is not, it's not a tremendously large area. Certainly, it's not as large as San Fernando corridor by any stretch of the imagination. So, do we have that? Have we done that? Have we done an inventory specifically of those businesses and or by type of business, and whether or not currently, as of when, and at that time, what was the actual vacancy or occupancy rate?
When I responded, I was talking anecdotally from my driving up and down the street. Community Redevelopment and Housing has not done an inventory. I will check with the Planning Department, Community Planning, to see if they did an inventory as part of their North Corridor study. If not, we can ask an intern to do that study and see what vacancy actually is.
All right, so the notion that it as an area or potential new area wouldn't qualify based on occupancy or vacancy really is a question that has no answer at this moment, as far as you know.
As far as I know, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So just following that line of thought, I'm assuming that showing a significant amount of vacancies would be evidence that would help us form a redevelopment zone there?
That's correct.
Do we know what the threshold is approximately?
No, you would make findings, and generally, those are that's left to you to decide. I would say that not only vacancies, but we would, and we're going to ask you if you want us to do this formal study. We would start to look at rents as well, maybe occupied, but if the rent is sub-market, that is also an element of blight.
Terrific. Okay. Any other comments, Mr. Drainer?
Yes, sorry. I didn't have an idea that anybody else would be asking these questions, so it caused me to ask yet another. Mr. Lansfang, isn't it also the case that, as you point out, the rents, although the space may be occupied, the concept that the property is underutilized is a factor, or the obsolescence of the buildings in the overall inventory is a factor?
Could be a form of economic blight.
And I think that is what you'll also find there as well.
And is it possible for us to ascertain what the trends might be over time for those businesses? Do we have any way of telling if the rents have been stable, going up, going down, and the vacancy rates?
We could survey the brokers that are
We'd
active
have to ask
in
the
that area.
brokers. How do other cities gather that kind of information?
I don't know that they're doing anything differently than looking at historical records of lists, list prices, and things of that nature, and just following general trends. Kind of depends on how far back you want to go. If you were to go 20 or 30 years, brokers that were active then may not be now.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Kazakian, do we have any other business? What's next?
Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
We are adjourned. Thank you.